Frank Diana. A key message in the Reimagining the Future body of work is that our growing digital world challenges every aspect of how we do business, how we govern, and how we live. It will drive significant strategic, tactical, and structural changes and fundamentally alter our long-standing beliefs, success strategies, and institutional constructs. And by institutional constructs, I'm referring to management, policy, process, procedure, legal frameworks, accounting principles, organization structure, business and operating models, governance, regulations, and the core characteristics of digitally fueled new era organizations. We're already seeing it. Just look at companies like Amazon, Uber, Airbnb, Tencent, Google, Alibaba, and Facebook. They are rewriting the rules and redefining how value is created and captured, using digitally centered platforms and ecosystem-enabled business models. As complexity and pace continue to intensify, uncertainty increases and volatility comes to the forefront. To thrive in this emerging future, we must embrace a framework for future thinking and enable an organization that can adapt as it shifts. In essence, we must see the future, rehearse it, continuously monitor for shifts, and adapt as the shifts occur. Today, I've invited two business leaders to share their insights and perspectives on the complexity of this transformative journey and the leadership challenges that emerge. Our first panelist is Hassan el Bouhali, Chief Information Officer at Bombardier Recreational Products. Hassan is a global executive with more than 20 years of experience across a variety of industries. He has successfully undertaken numerous transformational initiatives over the years and has an exceptional track record in leading global, cross-cultural, and high-performing teams. Joining Hassan is K Anananth Krishnan, Executive Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at Tata Consultancy Services. Ananth heads research and innovation for our firm and is a veteran member of the TCS corporate think tank. In his role, he has architected a 4E model that delivers substantive value to TCS and its customers by driving invention, innovation, and co-innovation. Thanks Hassan and Ananth for joining us today. A key topic of interest as we look to the emerging future is the leadership challenge that it poses and how we can prescriptively drive incremental value as we move into this future. Today, we're going to focus on three aspects of our emerging future. One is seeing it. The second is rehearsing it. And lastly, it's adapting to the number of shifts that we know will occur. In that regard, we're going to start with the question around the seeing piece. As we know, the pace, the uncertainty, the volatility, and the inability to predict is making it very challenging for us to see this emerging future. So the question, and I'll start with Hassan, is this: what can leaders do to better see this emerging future? Hassan?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. So, listen, I think the future has always been unavoidable, uncertain, complex, and volatile, as you mentioned. What's new, though, is that the complexity and uncertainty increase at a speed that's now beyond human absorption and adoption capabilities. So, for example, something that I can relate to as a CIO, all the advances in physics, in nanotechnologies, in quantum computing, in software engineering, artificial intelligence, and human-machine interface are now stretching totally our dot-connecting capabilities as leaders in established companies. These advances in these areas will for sure transform information technology industry, which will itself transform every other industry we know of and create new ones. So we all know that. The problem is, I don't know anybody in my network, very wide and diverse network, who can articulate in clear terms how all these advances will unfold in the future. So to better see this future, I think, given that increased complexity and uncertainty, we will need to look at it with different set of eyes and set of skills. We usually rely on industry leaders and consultants to help us build that better understanding of the future. I think that's not good enough anymore. I think we'll be looking as leaders in established companies. We'll be looking more and more into these futuristic type of leaders who can help us draw a picture with a set of plausible scenarios that are totally different from our present, but that are still credible. And that's I think, the way to start looking at the future.
Hassan, it's interesting you say that, because in my role as Chief Technology Officer of TCS, I have two challenges. One is to kind of predict the uncertain future for myself and the company that I work for. And secondly, to help our customers across different industries do the same for their businesses, because they come and ask people like me, what do I think about the future? So I have a dual challenge, if you will. Now, what I do is the following. While we do have a worldview that is built inside out from a TCS perspective, we depend on our product teams, our service teams, my research team, my innovation teams, and so on. I have learned over the years to depend on a outside-in view as much as I do on my internal resources. The co-innovation network that we have built over the years, startup companies all over the world, universities, our suppliers and partners, and increasingly our customers themselves across industries, are becoming a very useful supplement to those views on the emerging future. The challenge is to contextualize that diverse set of inputs into a coherent set of options which can become a basis for serious scenario planning, like you articulated. Mm-hmm. There, what I tend to use is to try and directly observe through primary research either my customer or my customer's customer as closely as I can, because the context in which this vast amount of information from startups, from universities, my own teams, etc., the way it can get real is if we actually observe it in the context of the customer or the customer's customer. So that's essentially my secret weapon, if you will.
That's an interesting perspective, and as you mentioned, yes, the challenge. There's not lack of knowledge and futuristic thinking out there and ideas out there. The challenge, as you mentioned, is to put all that together in the context of the company we're talking about or the industry we're talking about, and come up with plausible scenarios. So what I like what you said is that idea of looking up at the customer of our customers. So it's reaching out to the end consumer, kind of collecting the information and understanding how that consumer is really reacting to what the company is producing and selling, and then playing that backward to the industry or the company we're talking about. So that's definitely an interesting way of looking at that.
In fact, inside my team, we've developed a phrase. We call that end customer the selfie customer. The selfie customer essentially is our shorthand for the fully digital native. It's gender agnostic, it's nationality agnostic, it is demographic agnostic, and it sort of captures that end customer view outside in. So, but the larger point, Hassan, I'd like to really pick your brains on. Seeing the future is hard enough, but what do you do to actually rehearse the scenarios? That the seeing part of the exercise yields. I mean, there are multiple things that you need to prepare for in terms of possibilities and so on. What do you do?
Well, I can speak for the industries I know. I think the answer will be different from one industry to another. But I can speak for manufacturing industries, where we actually have an R&D and design process, product development process that will lead eventually to producing something that will eventually be distributed and sold to the end consumer. In these industries, I think historically, the whole product development process was a kind of a linear process with stages, multi-year programs, kind of thinking. And I think that way of doing product development and R&D and innovation is void. In my opinion, the whole product development and the whole innovation process will have to kind of adopt the lean startup type of concepts, like these concepts of minimum value product, these concepts of A/B testing. We need, as established companies, to start applying these concepts to our own R&D and innovation processes and start thinking about getting a minimum viable product out there that is different from what we've been doing historically, and testing that with the end consumer as fast as possible. So by doing so, the idea is to increase the number of potential scenarios, or the idea is to increase the number of potential products, potential services, potential markets where we're reaching to, and then accept to remove or disclose the ones or discard the ones that don't work, and pick the 1 or 2% that will work out of these testing. So that's how I would approach the issue we're talking about here.
In fact, you made me think the traditional R&D process is certainly valuable in doing foundational and fundamental research. Universities are probably the best place to do that. In an industrial context, I think we will have to segregate the really long-term strategic challenges of an organization, whether it's a manufacturing process or whether it's new materials or new product market kind of insights, to that category of long-running projects. But I think as innovation comes closer and closer to market, I like that idea of yours, where you said that agile, lean, minimum viable product, a startup mindset, quick to try, and if it needs to fail fast, fail cheap. That is a right mindset, in my view, for organizations to really start engaging with going from idea to execution. Incubation of ideas inside companies, I'm seeing that a fair bit. I do it myself. We have an incubator inside TCS for our own people, and we also engage with startups in that manner. The idea being that agility is no longer something which is an IT department function or capability. Agility has to be at the enterprise level, right from R&D to products to even business thinking. Is that a sort of a summary of your views as well?
That's exactly what I was thinking about. Yes, all these concepts of lean startup that come up from starting the IT industry will have to be applied, in my opinion, to the whole innovation and R&D processes. I'd like to hear your view on this open source concept, on opening innovation to an ecosystem rather than trying to protect in a traditional way the intellectual property when it comes to R&D and innovation. What's your view on that, especially in the manufacturing context?
In the software space, open innovation, open source as a method of implementing open innovation has become fairly well understood. And we certainly use a lot of open source. We contribute to certain communities in a very active way and engage. And it is very powerful. In other industries, there are close proxies. You asked specifically about manufacturing. I think manufacturing has evolved a method which is prevalent, for example, in Europe, and to some extent in other regions as well. They call it pre-competitive research. It is usually funded by government or multilateral funding agencies. Many industry participants become a part of a consortium or a group which is expressing interest in that pre-competitive research area.
Mm-hmm.
Up to the point where that research, typically done in university labs or in industry labs, produces a good enough baseline for more sort of proprietary specific work to be done. Then every individual company sort of absorbs that baseline and then works on their proprietary solution from then onwards. As an example, if somebody is building the next generation of electric vehicles, there's no point in everybody trying to come up with an original design for an electric vehicle from scratch. So they would typically go to a funding agency, a government, or any other multilateral method, create that collaborative baseline of all the things that everybody needs to have an electric vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody then uses that baseline to build their own competitive products on top of the baseline. So it's open, collaborative innovation up to a point, and then it becomes closed and proprietary beyond that.
That's really interesting. And if we go back to the original point about how to rehearse the future in an economically sustainable way, I think the companies, established companies, will have to find a way of doing product development, new product introduction that will help them get into all these various scenarios they're thinking about, but in an economic way, by sharing that risk and the cost of developing new products and new services upfront in what you just described. So that's a way of sharing the risk, but still allowing these companies to compete down the road once we have that common baseline defined.
Correct, and the focus is on speed of response. The listening part gives you the opportunities that you must invest in. Your response and the speed with which you're able to process those options and scenarios, collaboration certainly plays a role. If I may, I'd just like to spend a minute on something more closer to the digital space, which I suspect a lot of our listeners will be interested in. In the digital context, I talked about the selfie customer. The customer or the actions of our customer's customer will give us a lot of possibilities and insights. What we find is that unless an organization is really working hard on that digital DNA, again, using an internal TCS term, we tend to call this the digital spine. Spine mm-hmm. because, in biology, animals with a spine are supposedly more advanced and more intelligent than animals which do not have spines. So if you have a digital spine, then you're more digital than an organization that does not have a spine. So that's the logic. If you have to build a digital spine, you have to be able to not just master the common capabilities that you can get from open source or collaborative innovations, but you need a set of unique technology capabilities, be those cloud or APIs or ecosystem services, microservices in today's context, and so on. You need all that. You need to worry about digital capabilities like security and privacy. We've talked about agile and lean. I mean, that's another thing that I completely agree with your view that that's a capability that's into the spine. All these need very hard work for enabling an enterprise to be ready for this uncertain world. If you don't have this capability, the best listening and the best sort of sensing of what's going on, what are the scenarios in the world, and the best of intentions will not be sufficient. You have to be adaptive. You must have a digital spine. You must have a lot of the technology capabilities and the mindset that you rightly pointed out, the agility, the ability to do rapid cycles of innovation. I think that's the secret of success in this new world.
Yeah, I can't agree more. And then you just touched a sensitive chord for any CIO of any company. I think it's becoming now clear and clear to all that having this digital DNA or digital digital spine you're referring to is a prerequisite. It's now part of the cost of doing business. It's part of the foundation that any successful company will need to have. The challenge we have as CIOs is to explain these concepts or translate these concepts into concrete investment opportunities that would be approved by the company executives, and that's still a challenge. Unfortunately, it is still a challenge because there is clearly a gap and a disconnect between what the business understands from the need to react and be ready for the digital disruption that every single industry is going through, and the huge amount and effort of financial, human, and cultural and organizational investment that is required to build that basic digital spine required to build the future.
I have a thought on that. How do you segregate the resources? It's money, but it is also people, talent, bandwidth, partnerships, and so on, for what I would call the sustaining innovation agenda, things that are required for the current business to sustain itself and be competitive, from this disruptive innovation agenda, which is digital, which is the selfie customer and everything else that is happening in the world around us. So the portfolio approach to innovation is what I have been using in my role. Essentially, that points to the fact that we as CIOs and CTOs have to be able to articulate that this investment of time, energy, money, bandwidth is required to keep our business competitive into the foreseeable future if nothing else changes. That number is, let us say, 50% of the budget or 60% of the budget or whatever. There has to be a set of things that we have to put into what I call the platform budget. So these are things that we sit down and discuss with the business leadership as sort of foreseeable capabilities that the existing business will need if the digital disruption happens or new products and new capabilities are required based on the sensing for that particular company. And let's say that number for the platforms, visible platforms, is 10%, 20%, 30%. This is the conventional change budget. Mm-hmm. The most important thing is for the CIO or the CTO to carve out a budget and capability on maybe an external ecosystem of partners, which is specifically charged with looking at the disruptive innovation agenda. These are the things that the business may not anticipate directly, or they might know about it, but they don't really have the motivation to go and experiment or invest in it. This money, fortunately for me, comes directly from the board, the CEO, and the CFO. And I'm not saying it's mine to burn, but it's something that is very carefully invested in those unknown and unforeseeable experiments that every organization, in my view, needs to do. So it is a structured approach. It boils down to budgets, it boils down to bandwidth, resource allocation. The first two, we partner with the business. The third one, you have to partner directly with your board and your CEO.
I was thinking that this is the definitely traditional way of looking at IT through the run, grow, and transform lens. The challenge with that, I mean, everybody would agree with the concept when you present it. The challenge with then again, just to make discussion as practical as possible, is how to sell that to the executives in manufacturing more of traditional companies. I would say that in certain industries, the question is not asked at all. We just do it that way, and that's the way it is, and people are already converted. I'm thinking about retail or banking, for example. But in other industries, that bubble is not won yet. And I think the one way to approach it is to explain this basic concept of we need to have a portfolio with three buckets. One just to maintain the business as usual, one to change it as we move on, and one to truly work on true innovation. This is basic innovation management concepts or portfolio management concept that all R&Ds and engineering departments have been using for years or for generations. So I think the challenge of the CIOs is to manage to explain and convince the leadership that the same concept now applies to IT as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think it is not definitely a battle which is easy, and the role of IT, especially in the context of the digital disruptions, becomes more important because the IT folks in several traditional industries are pretty much the experts on the disruption possibilities. So it ties back to your earlier point on the listening and potentially the capabilities required to experiment and do those small innovations. The next step is essentially to educate the business leadership, whether it's the board, whether it's the CEO, whether it's the units and the presidents of the units and so on, in an iterative way. So I have seen many people from traditional industries outside of, as you rightly said, retail and banking. I mean, they get it, and so they don't really have to make too much of a case. In my case, the technology industry, by and large, we get it as well, so it's not that hard. But in traditional industries, I think I'm seeing a fair bit of interest from business leadership all the way to the top to go and, for example, visit Silicon Valley, to go to Israel on a fact and learning mission, to visit India or China to understand, customers and markets and competition and so on. So the IT department, I think, headed by the CIO, has to leverage this kind of opportunity. Most of these are technology-driven. Digital is at the core of it, and no better expert in a company than the CIO to actually be the lead in this sort of changing the mindsets of the people top down.
Exactly, which leads us to the discussion about the role of the CIO within the organizational structure, and the role of the CIO in actually influencing or impacting or changing the company culture. And I think for the CIO to do that role, to play that role properly and successfully, he needs to have, or she needs to have, that mandate from the company leadership. Without that mandate, it would be difficult take.
Completely agree, and that the CIOs who have been thought leaders and execution champions in their companies and their industries have that capability to work within the organizations. And I'm sure you would probably agree, in your organization as well, if you have a seat at the table where you can educate your peers and your and the board and other stakeholders, that's the first big step. And from then onwards, it's a question of doing those small experiments, demonstrating what the art of the possible is, and building up to that full-fledged mandate. I think there is no other way to, attack the problem if you have to succeed.
Yep.
Well, gentlemen, I really hate to cut this discussion off. It's been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate the fact that you've focused us on the see, rehearse, and adapt journey that most leaders are going to have to really follow in the next decade. Great insights, great conversation. I want to thank you both for joining us.